Now, agility is the mantra of success for any organization, and in today's fast-changing scenario, how does one build a dynamic organization? Well, before we get to the presentation, can I please thank our CSR partner, Satyabama, investment destination partner, MIDC, celebration partner, Diageo, cycling partner, Giant Stark & Bikes, and our housing partner, Sai Estate Consultant. Well, can I please invite Lisa to please come on stage, Lisa Gill of Reimaginaire and Tough Leadership Training, to please come on stage and make a presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here with you all today in Mumbai. So my name is Lisa, and I work with Reimaginaire and Tough Leadership Training. So my favorite thing to do is to coach teams and leaders and helping them find new ways of working together. And my passion is really facilitating workshops and dialogues that transform groups and help them discover whole new ways of communicating and liberate the potential of the people within. So today, the purpose of my session is going to be to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour. So it's about 20 minutes, and I'll just give you an overview of some of the trends of things that are happening out there in the world of work. And I'm going to talk about two sort of axes of change in particular. And then I'm going to share some first steps, some things that you can do in your organizations to start experimenting with new ways of working. So something's happening out there. And we are all, at the moment, seeing many changes, as we've talked about this morning. We're in a context of disruption. And I'm going to talk about organizations around the world that are doing things differently. And there are kind of two trends or two different directions that organizations are experimenting with at the moment. And the first is that organizations are looking at how they can structure things differently. So how can we organize ourselves differently, different procedures and processes, and kind of moving away from top-down to more distributed authority, more bottom-up. And then the second trend is that organizations are looking at ways of being and leadership and mindset. As Eduardo touched on this morning, our mindset profoundly influences how we behave and profoundly influences, therefore, the results that we get. So there are organizations who are looking at leadership and who we're being and what our mindset is in very different ways, in ways that are much more adult. So I'll be talking about these two different trends and different organizations and what they're doing. So we are all at the moment in a paradigm. So this paradigm is what gives us our way of being and the things that we're doing as leaders in particular. So in this traditional paradigm, we have managers being in such a way that they are top-down, and they're all wrestling, managers the world over, with this question, how do I make Peter ... Or how do I make my team more effective? How do I make my employees more engaged? How do I make my department more innovative? And the manager in this paradigm is someone who is being very responsible. So they own the problem. And often it means being quite inauthentic. We can kind of perform the manager role and be manager-y in the way that we are. And in essence, this way of being is like a parent to a child. It's like a parent-child way of being and dynamic between managers and employees. And in terms of doing in this traditional kind of paradigm, this dominant paradigm that we're all in at the moment, there are various different structures and strategies that we have for being in this paradigm. So things that we do to make decisions, policies and procedures that we have, how we motivate employees, performance reviews, incentives, all of these things that we do. So what's the alternative? Well, it can be easy, if we're not careful, to end up in the opposite, which is what happens a lot with startups, I find, and smaller organizations who really want to reject hierarchy and reject bureaucracy, and they swing so far in the opposite direction that they actually end up creating a leadership vacuum, Sometimes there's a culture with a real lack of accountability. You can end up with a culture that's very friendly and family-oriented, so it's a very nice place to work. But problems arise and tensions happen when someone in a team isn't pulling their weight or living up to their commitments, or something's been said and someone's done something different, and people aren't discussing that. They're afraid to kind of address those taboos. So then we kind of run into trouble and we can have dysfunctional cultures. And at the worst end of the spectrum, you can end up with organizations in complete chaos. So obviously, no hierarchy and no bureaucracy isn't the answer. So an alternative way of looking at work and how we're being at work is this paradigm, which is where the manager is accountable and responsible still on paper, yes, but my way of being is that I give you the responsibility for this problem or this challenge or this project, and then I coach you or support you in finding solutions. So I'm accountable and the responsibility lies with you. So it's a much more partnership-based culture. It's very trust-based. So it's moving away from this parent-child paradigm and towards an adult-to-adult paradigm, which is a very different way of being. And if we embody that way of being, as Eduardo said this morning, the effect that it has, the impact it has on others, suddenly people step into their potential and they are more creative, more intelligent. So it makes a big difference who I'm being and what my mindset is about how I'm relating to someone. And then, of course, in terms of doing, so I'm going to be talking about these being and doing, these two facets. In terms of doing, in this adult-to-adult paradigm, we have a whole other suite of different conversations, different purposes, different structures, many of which are very new and unfamiliar to us because we're so used to this previous paradigm. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of structures and being that organizations are doing differently. So it's difficult, as I said, because this paradigm that we're in currently has been going on for a long time. In many ways, little has changed since the Industrial Revolution. And this is something that you can read in any business book today, that in terms of how we're being and how we're leading and organizing ourselves, little has changed. So there are, of course, a few exceptions of companies. Interestingly, some companies set up, for example, 3M, founded in 1902, have been doing things differently for a long time. So it's not that the things I'm going to be talking about are super new. It's just that the dominant paradigm is still where it is, and these other organizations are starting to do different things. Another example is Semco. So some of you may have heard of the book Maverick by Ricardo Semler. And Semco in Brazil was doing innovative things in terms of how they were organized and how they led since the 80s. But in the majority of these companies are kind of pioneers, they're kind of rogues. But there is a sense from everyone that the traditional ways of working are working less and less. So the latest figures from Gallup are saying that only 15% of employees worldwide are engaged. So that means that 85% of employees in organizations the world over are either disengaged or actively disengaged. And as we've heard this morning, there is a real need, and I think everyone in this room can agree, that there's a sense that organizations need to transform and shift and adapt in order to meet the complex and uncertain environments that we're all working in at the moment. So we are seeing this paradigm shift now with organizations from patriarchy to partnership. So we heard that in the panel this morning about how paternalistic ways of leading used to be the norm, and now we're moving into something different. So there are organizations who are working with new structures and doing things structurally different. And as I said before, there can be a danger with startups and smaller organizations in particular that they neglect the leadership side of things. So they don't have a replacement for new ways of leading or new ways of, in terms of culture and mindset. And so as they grow, they might default back down into traditional structures, for example, or they might end up in trouble. And then you have organizations that are traditionally structured, because I want to be clear that hierarchy and bureaucracy aren't inherently bad or evil. That, like any technology, good or bad, it's how we apply it. So some organizations are set up traditionally, but they are exploring new ways of leading that are more empowering and more involving, and they are investing in creating a culture that is much more adult. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of the examples of structural differences that companies are exploring, and it is going to feel quite fast. There's quite a few to get through, but I just want to give you a kind of bird's eye view of some of the things that are going on. So some organizations are investing and exploring and experimenting with different degrees of self-organizing. So some companies are completely managerless, so they have no managers whatsoever, and other companies are hierarchical in their setup, but they may have some divisions or departments or teams that are self-managing or self-organizing. There are different terms, but effectively it means that the team has responsibility for various different functions that previously a manager would have responsibility for. So some examples are Haier in China, one of the largest white goods manufacturers in the world, and they have some 4,000 self-managing teams and a highly progressive CEO who's constantly reinventing their organization. And Buurtzorg is an organization in the Netherlands that's reinventing healthcare, so they have nurses organized in teams of 12, and they now have a workforce of 14,000, all operating without managers, and each team has a coach that supports them as well. And then here in India, in the north, we have a company called Yash Papers, who produces the paper packaging for companies like McDonald's and KFC. And they have self-managing teams. They're experimenting with different ideas of self-management. And here in Mumbai, you have the Dabbawalas, who deliver some 130,000 lunch boxes to offices around the city. And they are largely self-managing workforce, organizing themselves locally. And it's remarkable, a highly complex system that's highly efficient. So those are some examples of different degrees of self-organizing. And then there are companies who are results-only work environments. So these companies aren't interested really in how or when or where you do your work, so long as you deliver the results. So companies like Netflix and Virgin, you may have read in the news, have been experimenting with policies like the unlimited vacation policy. So it's highly trust-based. And then organizations who are looking at your own working time. So this was made famous by Google with their 20% time. So employees can spend 20% of their time on anything that they want. And that produced famous products like Gmail. Google doesn't do this anymore, I read. But companies like Atlassian, another IT company, they do this. And they also have innovation weeks. So it's encouraging and giving a high degree of autonomy to employees to learn and do different things in their own time. Beyond budgeting is a radical idea, the concept of an organization having no budget. But Handelsbanken and Statoil and Lego and countless other companies that are highly successful are finding that instead of setting budgets or arbitrary financial targets, they're instead organizing around purpose and values, and that's enough. Agile, this is something that kind of came out of the IT sector and frustrated software developers, but it's now spread into all sorts of different organizations and industries, and the idea is about pushing responsibility and authority down to those who are doing the work, and it's much more about people and interactions over processes, and much more about partnering with customers and team members, and having sort of more frequent feedback loops instead of the kind of waterfall project management process. And it's had a big influence in leadership thinking as well, like Management 3.0. And Lean we'll all have heard of from manufacturing and from Toyota, but again, this is moving into other industries and organizations, people who are adopting the principles of Lean to create Lean organizations, like Lean startups, for example. And again, there's a theme here of learning. You know, we're all here to talk about rebraining rather than rotting. So there's this theme of constantly learning. And then two structures without managers. So one is holacracy, another is sociocracy. They are similar in some of their principles, so it's about creating circles and devolving responsibilities into dedicated teams, and they have regular meetings to discuss kind of tactical and governance issues. And one example of holacracy is Zappos, which is the a shoe company owned by Amazon that famously rolled out holacracy some years ago, and it has been having some troubles with it because it's quite a complicated system. So many companies are taking holacracy as like an operating system to transition from the traditional paradigm into a new one, and then kind of evolving their own way of doing things and letting go of the things that don't work so well for them. And then finally, the last two examples of different structures that organizations are experimenting with I wanted to share come from two different books. So the first is this book, An Everyone Culture. And An Everyone Culture really focused on organizations that are called deliberately developmental organizations. So these are companies that have put people development at the very heart of what they do. So everyone in these organizations is encouraged to find their learning edge. What is the thing that's going to push them and challenge them into kind of evolving into their next state of being? So these are companies that kind of put development at the core of what they do. And then finally, there's this book, Reinventing Organizations, which came out in 2014 and has kind of inspired a whole wave and communities online around the world of people who are looking to reinvent their organization. So Frederick, the author, sort of shows how his theory is that as humans have evolved, we've evolved different paradigms and worldviews of organizations. And he says that this latest emerging paradigm of work, which he calls TEAL, are organizations that are characterized by self-management, as I mentioned earlier, wholeness, so organizations that are looking at bringing our whole selves to work and what does it mean to show up to work as the whole human being that I am and have kind of honest dialogues with one another. An evolutionary purpose, so moving away from command and control and a kind of 5-year plan towards much more of a sensing and responding to what are the needs of the people in the organization, where does it make sense for us to start going. So that's just a kind of overview of some of the structural changes that are going on out there in the world of work. And structural changes are good, but I really believe that in themselves it's not enough just to look at structures. And actually, I think it's far more valuable to start with being and leadership and mindset, because I find that when companies start to explore that side of things, then the structures can kind of emerge organically from that. So I spend a lot of my time coaching and training leaders, for example, in how to relate in a different way, how to lead in a way that's more adult-to-adult and more involving, kind of moving them towards that other paradigm. So 2 examples of this in practice are Google, who are, as we all know, kind of data fiends and addicts. And so they spent years and years combing through data from performance reviews, from employee surveys, from interviews, to try and discover what was it that made exceptional managers at Google. What was the difference between good managers and great managers? And they came up with these 8 behaviors that made the difference. And the top 3 in order were, number 1, be a good coach. Number 2 was to empower rather than micromanage. And number 3 was expressing interest in team members. So actually things like strategic thinking or being results-driven were far less important than being an empowering leader and being a great coach. And then in terms of teams and team effectiveness, again, they went through all of the data and they looked at what made exceptional teams. And they discovered that the most high-performing teams were making more mistakes than the other teams, and they were confused. And then what they realized was it wasn't these teams were making more mistakes, it was that they were being honest about them and they were sharing them and learning from them together. So the number 1 thing that made the difference for exceptional teams at Google was creating this culture of psychological safety. So creating a culture where it's okay and safe to take risks, to ask questions, to challenge one another, to challenge managers, for example. So this was really, really key. And if we apply that to some of the things I've been talking about in terms of moving from parent-child to adult-adult, we can see that when you have a culture that's high in motivation and accountability, but low in psychological safety, then you create this anxiety zone. And managers become like critical parents, controlling, punishing, and criticizing. And as we all know, that doesn't create a culture of learning or innovation or performance that inhibits people. But similarly, if we have cultures that are high in psychological safety and low in accountability and motivation, then we create a comfort zone. And that's not great either, because we create a culture of complacency, and we don't stretch people or challenge one another. And in both instances, it's not that managers are wrong, it's not that they are bad. Particularly in this case, often we have the best intentions as managers. We want to help people, we want to support them, we want to solve problems for them. But doing that, being like a caring parent, protecting them, actually holds them back and limits their potential. So the optimum is this learning zone, creating a culture that is psychologically safe and one where there is motivation and accountability. So that's the kind of epitome of adult to adult. So it's not free for all, it's not we can do whatever we want, it's that we make commitments to one another and we hold true to them, but it's a safe environment for us to learn together and grow and make mistakes and talk about what's really going on. So, in conclusion, I want to say that the way we're working isn't working, and I think we're all sensing this. There are limitations, and we're bumping up against things that aren't working in the world of work. And these three things here that Gary Hamel talks about, intellect, diligence, obedience, it used to be that those three things were enough. If employees brought those to work, you could be a pretty high-performing, competitive company. But those three things aren't enough anymore. And so if we want employees to bring passion and zeal and creativity and initiative, then we have to ask ourselves as leaders, how do we create an environment where people volunteer those gifts? And that's the question that's going to make a real difference, I believe. So what can you do? So if you're a leader, or I believe if you're anyone in an organization, you can start to involve the people around you in reinventing any and all of the structures in your organization that are no longer fit for purpose. And do it bit by bit. Start small and run small experiments, like Eduardo said this morning, and evaluate them. What's working, what isn't working, what do we need to do differently? And of course, there is no right way. There's no one way of doing this. There's no blueprint. So you can take inspiration from other organizations, but ultimately, you have to find your own way and what fits right for your company and your culture. And it helps to be really clear when you're running these experiments that you are clear and transparent with people about who has what authority about making decisions. Otherwise, it can undermine the whole process. So there's a really great book called Fierce Conversations, and Susan Scott has this decision tree model that helps clarify who can make what kinds of decisions. So that's really useful when you're going to start experimenting with new ways of working. And then in terms of being, so I said that this is all about new ways of doing and new ways of being. And I really believe that if we all involve ourselves in this deliberate practice of training ourselves as leaders and as people, and ask ourselves, who am I being in this conversation I'm about to have with my colleague or my employee? Who am I being? Because I think that who we are is more important than what we do. And the skills that are going to help us on this journey are things like coaching, giving empowering feedback, relationships, and facilitation. Facilitation skills are becoming really important in leadership, and transforming conflicts. So I really like this idea of moving away from conflicts as something bad or something to be avoided, and instead seeing conflicts as something that have great potential and something that can help us find ideas and solutions, deepen relationships. So transforming conflicts is key. And finally, developing a productive working climate. So creating a climate of psychological safety. How can we start to become attuned to and aware of what the climate is like in our team, in our meetings? Is it safe? Do we need to say something about it that it's not safe? And then how can we take responsibility for creating a climate that is psychologically safe? So those are just some starting points that I would invite you to start experimenting with, and I wish you all the best. And thank you very much for listening. If you are interested in some of these ideas, I host a podcast where I interview thought leaders around the world about self-management and progressive organizations. and I also blog on the subject, so it's something that I'm very passionate about and interested in and happy to have conversations about. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that's great food for thought for our next panel. Do you predict and control or sense and react? Can I please invite the rest of the panelists, Mr. Janmejaya Sinha, Chairman, Asia Pacific, BCG India, and Mr. Sunil Lulla, Managing Director and Chairman, Grey Worldwide. And can I also please invite the moderator of the session, Mr. Rajiv Dubey, Managing Editor, Business for TV and Digital.
Thanks, Shweta. And thanks, Lisa, for that account of how do you reinvent an organization from within, essentially changing the gut of the organization and transform it. So we thought we'll complement your talk with trying to understand how do you reinvent the organization strategically and tactically. And so let me start with Janmejaya. He earns a living out of transforming and reinventing organizations. He's done plenty of them. Let's start with this, Janmejaya. How do you first figure out when is it time to reinvent an organization, and when do you begin work on that? Or would you say that this is a process that must go on all the time?
So let me draw a contrast for you. If you ever meet a person who is just starting to run the marathon, or has gone on a weight loss program, or is doing anything for self-improvement, whenever they talk about it, they'll talk with great excitement. They'll say, did you see, I've run 22 kilometers today. Do you see I've lost 5 kilos? Do you see how I'm looking? And it's all with a great deal of enthusiasm. And whenever you use the word organizational transformation, the blood drains out of everyone in the organization. They just look and say, oh my God, this is bad. I don't know whether I'm going to be looking like Synergy tomorrow. So, the question is, whenever organizations go towards the transformation, it's too late. The basic concept of transformation is that it has to be always on. And if you're going to do it too late, you're going to focus on the short term, and your entire organization is going to lose all its blood. And it's just going to freeze, and it's going to be petrified, and it's not going to work. So the entire thinking about transformation in today's world is that it has to be always on, and you need to get the organization engaged and involved and participate in this journey.
And so no waiting game, Sunil, no waiting game that a lot of organizations tend to make the mistake of. Wait it out and see, how far this goes. Is this a change that is going to pass through, or is it going to really affect us? That's one of the challenges organizations face, whether they should wait or they should react immediately.
I've never had the fortune of having to wait. Okay, wherever I've worked at and been at, I've seen the pace of change. It comes with ambition. If the shareholder or the company or the organization is ambitious, the people will be ambitious. And it will invoke that change. You can't, yes, the attempt is to change an organization, but I think you are really changing people, right? And when you're dealing with large scale, there are 1,000 people, 100,000 people, you have to find effective tools which can go there and change those people. And it's not just by virtue of a conversation, it's by the goals that are set, it's by the compensation that rewards those people, it's the freedom you give, it's the challenges you give. And it really depends also on your marketplace position, right? It's not a surprise that companies, when they come from the back, they have a very different zeal than companies which are on the top. Because they can't tell their people, run faster before somebody overtakes us.
Yeah.
For the simple reason that they don't want to admit they can be overtaken. But companies which are behind can often just say, hey, here's one target, let's at least go 5 steps ahead. Right? So I think I agree with what he says. Change is constant, so you can't sit back.
So Lisa, internally, asking people to do, how difficult is that transition? How difficult is making it ingrained in the organization to make those changes from the people's point of view, internally?
Sorry, can you say that again? How is it, what was the question?
Internally, how do you make it internal to the organization, to the people, to make that change, to reinvent all the time?
Yeah, I think I agree with what both of you have been saying. This idea that we change an organization and then freeze it until the time comes to change it again is not a useful mindset to have. But I think in terms of internally transforming, I'm a real believer in involving everyone, in real bottom-up change, and using tools like liberating structures, for example, that change the way that we have dialogues with people and engage people in discussions, and create more of like a workshop environment of attacking different challenges and how we can come up with new solutions together. So I think doing change to people is never a good idea or effective, and involving people is not just more cost effective in terms of energy and money, but also you get all kinds of engagement and ideas and energy that you wouldn't otherwise get. So I think involving people as much as possible and using new tools or different tools like liberating structures to do that.
Now we have enough examples from around the world, whether it is IBM, Janmejaya, if you look at it, what it was in 1984 and what it is today. Nokia started out as a paper mill and then started making rubber boots, and then sold off the telecom business, the handset business, where they led the industry for almost a decade. Then there is Nintendo, of course. It was a playing cards company started out with. There is Shell. The name Shell comes from selling decorative shells in East London out of a small store, and being an oil company. How do you ensure that it almost seems like it's best to be a chameleon in the business, to be changing colors all the time? How do you ensure that your organization is a chameleon in business?
Well, I think what you are saying is that survival is the greatest success for an organization. That you have very few infinitely lived companies. And in fact, the number of companies that can, in 1928, I had done a bit of an analysis. That time you'd have Standard & Poor's 100. A company that got into the Standard & Poor's 100 would stay there for 68 years. Today, we did, in my book, we did this analysis of 35,000 listed US companies. And 1/3 leave that list every 5 years. So think about it, about 12,000, about something like 8,000 companies are not knocked out of that list. So the pace of change has grown, and your earlier success becomes the greatest hindrance, so you have to just be able to shed the past of your success and fix things that are not broken to stay where you have to be. This requires a very different thinking, and one which challenges any established mode of operation. And, you look at it, why do people survive like that? That's a deep question. And, the answers don't come from just doing what you did yesterday better. And you need to be able to really address what it is that you were doing and whether it can continue to be done today or tomorrow.
Sunil, you've seen some of these organizations closely, and in fact, you make your living out of communicating to the world what they do and how they do that and how they make those changes. Your observations on how do you ensure that organization is reinventing all the time?
I think companies get pushed by pressures of their consumers, of the competitors, of an environment which could be regulatory or otherwise. And they also get pushed by their own ambition. So to me, the human body and the organization, as we all know, are analogous, right? We evolve our diet habits, our fitness habits, our lifestyle habits. And organizations therefore need to do that. They need to find new focus. As long as you're looking at ways to its point of survival, right? Survival does not mean the absolute end, which is death. It just means at least being able to survive tomorrow the way I survived today, and hopefully I'm growing with that survival. So if you want to add that momentum to your system, you need to see what am I doing creatively to disrupt what I have done yesterday. And how do I bring that creative change to my business as a solution, as a service, as a value? So you use the word chameleon, and that's interesting because the word of consistency is equally important, right? So even if you are going to change, you must have some things which are consistent. Because organization will succeed when people believe there is something here that is consistent which keeps me going. And that is a balancing act that businesses have to do. So I think that businesses that force change don't succeed.
Sure.
Businesses that evolve change succeed.
And lead change. Lisa, how do you ensure that even from the organization's point of view, tactically, they are making the right moves from the management's point of view, ensuring the success of the organization into the future?
It's a good question. The founder of Holacracy actually has a good story, a good analogy of when he was training to be a pilot and he was flying a plane and he saw that he had this warning light flashing, but none of his other warning lights were flashing, and he thought, well, if none of the other lights are flashing, then it must just be a fault with that one little light. How bad can it be? But it turns out it was really important, that warning light, and he nearly crashed the plane and died. So luckily he was able to rescue the situation. But he saw in that a lesson about leadership, that if you're the CEO of an organization, no matter how great your people are and how much dialogue you have with them, it's impossible to know what's going on at all levels and what's going on in the front line and what's happening and how to, adjust things. And so that's why I'm really interested in this concept of self-managing and self-organizing teams, because then you can be much more attuned and listening and sensing what's going on in the organization at a more local level and how you can adjust things. So in biology, we have kind of two methods of evolution. We have one route is like optimization, so species evolving to get better and better, and another one is diversification. So nature kind of fires off all kinds of different subspecies, and the ones that are strongest or can adapt to their environments the best survive. And I think organizations can learn from that too. And I think Eduardo's slide with the graph and the many different little experiments, firing off, some will fail, but some will succeed. And I think the more little experiments you run, the better.
Could I just give a slightly different, an additional perspective? Three of us wrote this book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. And we have found that there are two dimensions on which an organization has to locate itself. On the dimension of predictability and on the dimension of malleability of their environment. So typically, in the past, if you were an organization, you would be what we would have called a classical kind of an organization, where you knew you could predict the future, but you could not shape it. And it would, if you look at cereals, you look at some of these traditional industries like utilities, etc., you could pretty much predict it, but you could not shape it. And there the strategy used to basically be to become big so that you had advantage. But then, you can get into states which you cannot predict and you cannot shape. Now, where you cannot predict and you cannot shape, you have to be agile. You have to react to the environment very quickly. You have to experiment and kill the experiment quickly. But then you can have a situation where you believe you can both predict and shape. And Apple could decide that, I can create this new product which people are not aware of, and I can shape it. But then you better be, you have to persist, but if you're not right, you're gone. You have to, and then you can have an environment which you cannot shape. You cannot predict, but you can shape. where you become like an Alibaba. You create a platform and you can control it. Your strategies and the way you operate in these has to vary depending on how you see that external environment. So it is, you cannot just say that all organizations are operating in the same external environment. There are actually very different environments for different organizations.
And one of the things that is said is that your maturing businesses, which are probably going to run out of steam in a year, 2 years, 5 years, should be supported by growth businesses and then supported by businesses which are just about starting. So how do you ensure that, in India we have examples like ITC which has done this so beautifully. We have also had examples like Nokia, which did it beautifully but then lost steam somewhere. So how do you ensure that, even if you look at the India Today group, a solitary magazine ruled the magazine space, went to television, ruled the television, now getting into digital space. How do you ensure that this process goes on all the time? Because that's the job of the management and the leaders of the organization.
See, the core equity of the business is important. If the core equity is about creating value, so in the case of your group, it is content, right? And it's either information or entertainment through content. Then that's the core equity that's been replicated as newer things have happened. And if you can translate that core equity effectively in a new format, then you're able to sustain it, right? So if you take food products, Mr. Sodhi is here, milk, and it comes into many, many forms, right? But the core equity of that milk is what is carrying it into other forms, right? Whether it's yogurt, whether it's lassi, whatever, it's that core equity. So companies which know that core equity, understand why that consumer buys that core equity, effectively moves ahead, right? I mean, in India, I know, let's look at the example. Taxis are licensed. There's an authority that licenses it. There comes the Uber, it changes things. Yeah. Today, there are people who are unhappy with Uber because it's the same driver which is moving around. But this will balance out. If the local taxi authorities knew their core equity was service and not just, dropping people on and off, they would operate very differently, right? But as an organization, they are more unionized, and their equity is protection. It's not service. So I think you've got to define your core equity.
Janmejaya?
I think it's a profound question, and if there were easy answers, we would not certainly be telling it to you. We would all be becoming billionaires. I think, look, in your group, which has been hugely successful, the question of whether it's content, whether it's connections, how do you monetize your connections and your content, these are important questions, and they are evolving at rapid rate. Who would think that for the IPL you would have had Facebook bidding for it? You just completely reorients how you think about this, or Geo bidding for it. You can't really think about this carefully. So one of the things that you really have to do today if you're a leader is really be open to challenging the paradigms that you have grown up with. And the world, the way you look at the world comes through a certain lens that you look at it. And you need to be able to keep saying, can you bring in a different lens to look at this world and be able to appreciate it? But you have to, in the meantime, commit to whatever you know and go forward, because inaction is the sure death. But when you are taking action, you need to be just comfortable with the ability to deal with a fair amount of ambiguity.
So, purpose, organizations finding purpose and defining their purpose is what drives people, right? It's what drives the organization. Every company doesn't define it. And then staying with it, I think that is key, to find that purpose.
And for any
I agree with that. I really feel that in today's world, the best analogy for this will come from the most uncommon places. You look at ISIS. We can blame them and we can abuse them and we can really be affected by them. But how the hell do you get so many 20, 25-year and 30-year-old guys going and willing to kill themselves for a purpose? You look at the different places and you have to just keep asking yourself, what's going on here? What's going on here? What is the connection? The army, we keep talking about incentives in organizations. What incentive do you offer a Jawan to go take that hill, and the chance of your being killed is 7 out of 10. You know, I mean, pride, honor, I mean, it's so this, what Sunil said right now, is a profoundly important point, and organizations quite often skirt over it. And it doesn't work. I mean, you can't say, I want to have this return on equity or this return on capital. Most people in your organizations don't get it, but they can connect with a purpose.
Sure. And Lisa, you did mention in your presentation that it is mostly top down. How do you ensure that it is involved, that it's bottoms up as much as it is top down? Because strategy obviously has to come top down, or how do you ensure that strategy is evolved with the people involved?
Yeah, I think one example, you mentioned terrorism and the army, and there's a book called Team of Teams, and General Stanley McChrystal talks about similar challenges that the US military were facing in Iraq. And he developed and radically transformed how they operated by through two things. One, through decentralizing their operations, so they couldn't compete with the kind of guerrilla forces who were, really agile and able to move really quickly. Having like a centralized HQ was slowing down their process, so he decentralized everything, and they introduced radical transparency. So that was highly controversial because they were having briefings with highly sensitive material and opening up to all levels of the organization. But it worked, and it enabled them to be far more effective. So I think those two principles are really useful to bear in mind. How can you decentralize things? If you're kind of bottlenecking everything, all decisions at the top, then you'll struggle. And also transparency makes a big difference. If you can be transparent about everything that's going on in the organization. And it's a bit of a cliche now, but I think the statement that culture eats strategy for breakfast is definitely true, and creating a culture and modeling the kinds of things that you want in your culture is really key.
Mm-hmm. Janmejaya, where does the top-down approach stop and where does bottoms-up approach begin, or how does that work for an organization where you are actually reinventing an organization? How far should it be top-down and how far should it be bottoms-up?
Look, to be honest with you, I think this is a false discussion. Every organization has leaders and they have to set a certain tone. And, the basic questions is, what are the various axes of being directive, being inclusive, being cooperative, in the various choices that you're making. Lisa talked earlier about agility. One of the elements that you cannot have in any organization today is too much time. So the fact is, how do you compress the time to decision? And compressing the time to decision, you have to take out the silos in organizations. And that's the discussion around agility. So if you're a bank, you don't have to fight between retail and credit and back office and front office and all that. You need to have a team which is empowered, which says for this customer journey of housing loan, okay? From the moment the customer wants to identify a house till the end, you guys are going to every 15 days keep ensuring that your approach to the market on this whole exercise from beginning to end is the best that there is. And the IT guy and the risk guy and everyone are sitting together and working together. So that shift, empowered by the top and encouraged and supported, is how it works. So when we start saying, bottom up, top down, I think that's a simplification which doesn't have much meaning to it.
Okay. Sunil?
See, I think the word open culture is another way to see it. It's not about an open office. It's about being able to look outside and bring that inside you. And then take what is your core value and communicate that, right? And that's how you build that culture. So you're constantly building a culture with a community that's outside. So you're effectively transacting to communicate why you're good, and you are absorbing what you can learn from there, what you can bring in, and saying this is good, I can't do it. This is great, I must do it. And oh hell, why didn't I do this? Right? So if you can build that culture and make it last over a period of time and continuously, you're getting there.
how do you tackle organizational resistance to any such reinvention? You know, Janmejaya started his discussion with that, you know, that, oh my God, am I going to lose my job? That's the first reaction to any thought of reorganization or reinvention or transformation. So how do you tackle the organizational resistance to change?
So I've seen that a few times.
Higher BCG.
Sorry?
Higher BCG.
Hire BCG, yes, that's correct. First you hire BCG. But I think I've seen that a few times, and it comes back to defining their purpose. If people identify with the purpose, they will follow it. If they don't identify with the purpose, then some of them will go, right? And which means either they are seeing things differently, or you're not telling that story well enough to them, or making them realize it well enough. But you're very clean and transparent about what you want to achieve.
In fact, you know, I think Sunil hit the nail on the head. If you want to do an organizational transformation, learn from a personal transformation. What does a personal transformation want? First, it has to have a purpose. Second, you have to go all in, meaning you can't just do short-term cost cutting. You need to have a vision towards which, if you want to run a marathon, you'll need to lose weight, but then you'll have to learn to do the weights, practice, run. The same thing for an organization. You will need to say, what is my goal? What do I need? The third thing is you have to train your people so that they don't feel overwhelmed and scared about it. The fourth thing is that you need to ensure that they are all willing to learn, and learning becomes an integral part of the organization. And then the fifth is you have to both be directive and inclusive, you know, in trying to get there. So if you just say organization, transformation, cost cutting, you're going, then of course everyone is freezing and hating it, you know, but you have to begin with purpose.
Lisa, how do you reckon one should tackle organizational resistance?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Sunil, that being clear and transparent is really key. And I think if you take that a step further, you know, I talked earlier about moving from a parent-child paradigm to an adult-to-adult paradigm. In a parent-child paradigm, you know, we do change to people. We tell people this is how it's going to be, and, you know, like it or lump it. In an adult-to-adult paradigm, the question of choice becomes really important. So we can be clear and transparent about where it is that we want to go as an organization. And then it's about giving people a choice. You know, do you choose to come along on this journey, and do you commit to this? And what questions and information do you need in order to make that choice? So it's kind of giving them the responsibility rather than kind of owning the responsibility as a leader and then kind of coercing people. It's much more effective to really involve people and get their mandate and get them to really choose and take responsibility for the transformation as well.
So we would like to take some questions from the panel towards the end of the discussion, but you could keep the questions ready. But let me ask, what is your most favorite organization reinvention in your view? 1, 2, 3 that you would like.
Asking me?
Yeah, yeah.
I never answer this question. I'll lose my business, you know.
Sunil?
So for me, and I can anecdotally say this because it doesn't compete with your group, right, is the rollout of MTV in India. You know, MTV came to India for a channel of my age at that time, right? We were all headbangers and we wanted rock music and we wanted English music. But after the 5 people who live in Colaba, there was nobody else who wanted it, right? It had a line which says, do you get it? And nobody got it. So the challenge over there was, first of all, convincing the shareholders sitting in the US that there needs to be a change, because in many markets it's pretty much similar. They had not yet started seeing the localization impact that took place, you know, over the 90s and 2000. And that was the first challenge, but we had a very supportive leader in Tom Freston, the global CEO, who believed in that. 2 was the people who were running this across the world never understood Indian music. The Indian music is based on soundtrack, right? So we did a research. We checked out with 5,000 consumers, which is the most popular artist. You could throw a stone and hit a wall and you get the answer. So Mohammad Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar, right? But they don't have the kind of songs that anyone's going to get up and dance at. And the third came people. There's great resistance in those days, I'm not saying today, when Bollywood was not even called Bollywood, right? to actually believe that that can work culturally. But it's how you package it. To me, that was it took a bit of effort, but it got done because a handful of us were clear about the purpose. We were transparent and open about it. We changed the entire organization, which started the American version to what became the Indian version. And that channel continues to see success. Right? It's a simple, small media business. But the challenge I have seen across businesses is identical. You got to find that band that will believe in it. They need not be the top band. They need not be leaders at one level. It could be across the organization. Right? If you believe in it, put yourself to it, you're home.
Janmejaya, even outside India, people you may not have worked with?
We are a global firm. So, you know, you can, this is a business which you don't get into because whoever you don't name, you offend, you know, and so it's not something that I get into at all.
Okay. Lisa, your favorite reinvention?
Yeah, I think I have many favorites, but a current one that's inspiring to me is the Chinese company I mentioned, Haier, and their CEO, who's like one of the most well-read CEOs out there and incredibly progressive, to kind of mark the end of one era and kind of usher in a new one. He gathered all of his employees together and he took a sledgehammer to one of their fridges and smashed it to pieces as a kind of symbolic gesture that, you know, we're not going to stand for this level of quality anymore, and we're now kind of moving into a new era. And Haier have reinvented themselves many times since, and they are an incredibly interesting organization to be watching at the moment.
And what would you consider as the most spectacular failure that you've come across?
I guess, well, Blockbuster comes to mind, I guess, if you compare Blockbuster to Netflix, for example, and their kind of ability to adapt and respond to change. That's one that comes to mind.
You know, there is a saying in Hindi, कि हवेली की उम्र 60 साल होती है. You know, I mean, a castle lasts 60 years.
Yeah.
So to imagine that a company will live forever is very unlikely. I mean, Kodak was one of the great brands. My first consulting assignment was with Kodak.
Yeah.
And now it's in chapter 11, right? I mean, so...
And now it's some Bitcoin company or something.
Yeah, you know, so I mean, I'm just saying that getting into this predicting business is to be ready to get mud on your face, you know.
Yeah. Sunil, spectacular failure?
Well, I think I can't name them because you will write about them and then I'll get into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
But I will tell you what did not work. It was a partnership, an equal partnership on paper between a corporation and a bunch of talented individuals. But the corporation which owned 50% behaved like it was 100%. And that never works, right? Which is, you can't marry two unequals. You've got to find a balance over there. Mm-hmm. And everything goes downhill when that marriage doesn't work.
So apparently we do not have enough time for the questions. Mr. Bajaj, if you can quickly ask a question and then we can wrap it up with. We have just about a minute and a half. Can't hear.
Check. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. In this age of discontinuity, where the path of success that we have gone over so many years is going to be dismantled, we are looking at an architecture 5 years, say, from now. Now, unless we know that architecture, the new architecture, we will not be able to influence the skills and the value chains which will be required to be prepared to serve that new architecture. Now, how do I know what is that new architecture? What are the signals? What are the pathways? Who are the consultants who can give an idea? And I don't agree with you that a company has to fail unless it doesn't reinvent itself. If it keeps on reinventing, companies can go on forever as far as I'm concerned. I don't agree with you that 60 years, you know, it's not like a human being whose life is 80 years now or whatever. So how do we, this is so crucial. We know that we cannot do the business the way we are doing. But what is that new business that will be there? We have no idea.
So only 3% of companies survive longer than 60 years. So you have to be in that 3%. And so of course you're right, but then you have to be in a very, very narrow stream. And you need to be able to draw the distinction between reinvention and exploration. Meaning every company can exploit what they have got and give higher returns, or they can reinvent themselves, and that right balance allows them to survive longer. That's my view.
I was just going to say that I really believe that as leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. So you don't have to know what you're going to be reinventing towards. I think it's far more important as a leader to ask the right questions. And I think if we start using different kinds of tools to engage and involve people, we'll discover that often the people, you know, I know we've kind of moved away from this reductive term of bottom up, top down, but I really think if you involve people, people in the organization will have a much better sense of what needs to change and have an idea of how you might start to do that. So I think asking the right questions and involving people is the path to discovering where you need to go.
If I may, I think the survival strategy and the growth strategy are coterminous. They exist together. They run in parallel. So you have to have a strategy to survive, because you don't know, like you rightly said, where you're going to get hit from. And you want to grow, that's your ambition, then you got to have that. They may be parallel, they may cross, they may be two different paths. Then you figure out what you want to do. But you have to have both at all times.
So I read this brilliant quote the other day which says, changing the paradigm is the price of surviving success. And I loved each word of that, because firstly you have to survive success, you know, and to survive success you need to change the paradigm. I thought that was pretty cool.
Well, I hope you've been able to take out something from these discussions, and may you all be chameleons in business. Thank you so much. Thanks to the panelists for being here. Over to Shweta.